Can you go back in your mind to the 6th of December, 1917, and tell me what you remember from that day?
I most certainly can, because I was looking out the window this morning, and I thought to myself, it smells like Halifax, but it doesn't look like Halifax, because that morning there wasn't any snow on the ground. It was just clear. Halifax is like that the snow comes and goes quickly due to the fog in the Atlantic Ocean, and it isn't like the Bay of Fundy that comes and stays for the day. So I can remember very vividly, and I was going to school early because we were rehearsing for a Christmas play, and strangely enough, the Christmas play was Alice in Wonderland. And I was going to be the Duchess. And I thought I owned the world at that point, that I could do anything, and I was headed, of course, right for Hollywood. But that wasn't the case, but I went early. If I had not gone early to school, I wouldn't be chatting with you now, because the sash and the glass of the window came across my pillow, and I would have been decapitated, probably. So I'm thankful to be here. And I can certainly remember anyone, frankly, I would say, anyone who's experienced the Halifax explosion, if they had a brain in their head at all, and they were left living, they would never forget it. It would be probably on their mind indelibly.
How old were you?
Ah, that's the question, isn't it? I was 8 years old. I was 8 years and 2 months, as a matter of fact. So and I'm a very inquisitive child that liked to, but I had gone to school, and we were practicing, and they were building down around beyond the school. They were building an apartment building, and they were doing some blasting. So it would be natural to assume that when the explosion happened, although there was one difference, there was no bang. Now, that may have been because the Citadel, perhaps on the other side of the Citadel, where the explosion occurred out at the Narrows, they may have shielded it, a bit. But I wouldn't. It just had made a funny noise, like, it would be concussion, probably, of the two ships banging together. And that, of course, were the two ships, the Imo and the Mont Blanc. So I don't know to this day, and I don't know, of course, until I meet her in eternity, if we recognize each other at that time. Mother Wynne was teaching, the nuns were called Mother in those days, they're called Sister now, and I should go back a little bit and say that the College Street School, where I began my education, was in the convent grounds. They owned the grounds, and they built the school there. The city needed another school, and they built it there partly under the jurisdiction of the Halifax School Board, but partly also on their own with added subjects. So I would say that morning Mother Wynne was coaching us for the play. And I was just about to say, as the Duchess, "Off with their heads." And suddenly Mother Wynne said, "Down on the floor, put your arms over your heads." And it never occurred to us not to obey instantly, and right speedily, too. So we did that. But being an inquisitive child, I peeked a little bit out of my hands, just a little, one eye. But you can do quite a lot with one eye if you're determined. And at that time, And I don't know how Mother Wynne had the premonition of disaster, but she must have, because I looked up, grade 2 was in the auditorium, and there was the stage back of the schoolroom, which they had come auditorium. There were 2 statues, one of St. Joseph on one end of the stage and one of the Blessed Virgin, and they were life-size. And they were on a large pedestal. So I saw them revolving just as if they were on a turntable on the pedestal. And in a seconds or two, because it didn't take very long for it to be a disaster, they stood still and there wasn't a scratch on them. Not a scratch, and they didn't fall off the pedestal. To this day, I don't know whether God had a hand in that or what, but certainly that is factual. That's not fantasy. That's quite factual. And then, of course, splintering glass and everything just fell apart. So we were not allowed to, when we thought it was clear enough for us to get up, we were allowed to get up and sit at our desks, but not go anywhere or do anything until Mother Wynne found out just what was going on. It didn't take very long for that either. And at that time, you see, we didn't go into school for some reason which I don't know. I can't tell you that. But we didn't go into classes until 9 o'clock. So it was 5 minutes after 9 on the 6th of December that this occurred. It made quite a difference. And how she knew, I think there were about 8 of us there rehearsing for this play, and how she knew to say that, I'm sure I can't tell you anything about that at all, because we had no premonition of any disaster. Anyway, everything fell apart, and then it had to be ascertained whether we could go out on the street and go home. Well, we found out to our dismay that we couldn't do that, because the street was strewn with glass, electric wires, a danger just right out on put your one foot out and you were in danger, no problem at all. So we had to stay a little while. And then Mother Wynne wanted to know what we could do, where we could go, and how we could do it. So she went over to the convent. And, I look back on that and look back today. There was no such thing as children. And at 8 years of age, some were perhaps 9, and some were almost 8. But there was no thought in our mind that we should disobey. And I think that is one of the most remarkable things of the explosion. We obeyed instantly, without question. I don't know whether that would be possible today or not.
What happened after Mother Wynne was able to determine what had happened in the city? I mean, what were the thoughts that went through your mind? Did you worry about your family?
I thought it was blasting down at the apartment building that they were building, and I thought when we went outside, of course, that everything would be quite normal, and we would be able to go home because the school was shattered. And when we did get to look out, not the window, but where the window should have been, we saw a disaster all around us. You can't imagine it unless you have seen something comparable to that, and I don't know how you would see it. So we went out downstairs. We were upstairs. And we went downstairs, and by that time, some of the police had come and said we could not go out at all until there was a place for us to walk. There was no sidewalk, no streets that were safe, because all the telephone wires, the electrical wires, were down on the ground, and of course were live. A lot of people were electrocuted just because they stepped in the wrong place. And that was a very difficult situation. What would you do with children that were, and whether there was any home to go to. I didn't even know, where my parents were or what was happening. But a neighbor of ours in Halifax went in next door and said to my mother, mother told me afterwards, is there anything I can do for you? And she said, yes. You could go to school and see if Elinor's all right. She's been gone for an hour or more, and I don't know. I have no idea. My sister was at home, and they were having a late breakfast, or a hurried breakfast probably. And my mother had said to my father, Will, I think there's something wrong with the furnace. It's rumbling a bit. And so he got up and got halfway down to the furnace when the explosion occurred. Don't ask me how Mother knew there was something wrong, but she was very intuitive in situations like that. My sister, for some reason or other, got up from her chair, and thank God she did, because the dining room windows, which were picture windows, would have come in right on her chair where she was sitting. And she ran in the pantry. We had a large pantry. And the ironing board, in its flight of fancy, fell on her and knocked her out. She wasn't hurt. But my mother instinctively put her arm up across her eye, like this. Always did that when, in a thunderstorm or anything else. And she was cut right where her left eye would have been. But she saved her eyes, you see. Father saved himself, but they didn't know where Elinor was. And that was, I can imagine now, having lost my children, that what it was like, that what Mother was going through. Anyway, he had been a Boy Scout, so he went down to, he knew where I went to school, and he went down to school and was allowed to come in and see that I was all right. I didn't have a scratch of any kind. We were fine. God was with us the whole way, and he took me home, and on the way home, which was a walk of approximately, give or take, 10 minutes, but it wouldn't be any more than that at the outside. And I looked around me as I walked home. There were policemen and just saying where were the safe areas, you see, that you could walk. And it was incredible, the destruction. Absolutely incredible. And remember this, we in the West End of Halifax were in the so-called protected area. We didn't get the brunt of it. So I don't know if you have a vivid imagination, anyone who is listening, because you couldn't imagine it unless you have seen something like it. There was destruction everywhere. There wasn't a square inch. And we had only one window in our 10-roomed house that wasn't broken to smithereens. The bedroom window where I slept, the window had come in, sash and all, and was lying across my pillow. So if I had been home and in my bed, it would have been off with my head, not off with the rest of them.
Now you got home and were reunited with your family. What were the next few hours and even days like?
Panic, really, when we found how desperate it was. But, I'm sure my mother was going through a great deal more because my father was Assistant City Engineer of Halifax at that time, and he had to report to City Hall immediately. There were no telephones, there was no anything, there were no taxis, there were no cars, most of them had been demolished. So, but he had to go, that was his job. Something had to be done, and be done quickly. There was no hesitation, and you had to have your wits about you. I've often wondered how how my father ever managed with that. It was a gray day by then, gray skies, getting colder, but no snow. And then I think the most traumatic part of the whole thing was when a man came by up our street, Henry Street, on horseback, calling to everybody, and they did this at random, people on horseback, because there wasn't anything else to go on but horses, if they were alive, and a lot were killed, of course. There were no cars, no anything. And telling us to get out, take what was necessary, and go to the nearest vacant lot. There was a threat of a second explosion, because the boats were up near the ammunition dump, which was on the Dartmouth side of the harbor, up near they were up just a little bit past the Narrows, what is called the Narrows in Halifax, where the ships came up and entered into Bedford Basin during the Second World War and stayed there until the convoy was ready to go. And so the ammunition dumps were there on the Dartmouth side, and they had caught fire. Now, whether they could get the fire put out before they blew up, but we had to leave our homes, because if we'd have been annihilated completely, Halifax would have been no more. That was all there was to it, because there was so much gone already, and they would have been in a strategic point that the West End would not have been protected at all in any way, shape, or form. So we moved out. There was one vacant lot fairly near our house, and the one right next to the vacant lot was a house where there was a bedridden son who was not able to walk and get out of bed. I don't know exactly what it was, but I think it was polio. And his father said, "I will not leave him." So his mother and the other members of the family had to come out in the vacant lot and leave her husband and her son in there, not knowing what was going to happen next. But I remember that very, very distinctly. But I was probably very terrified too, and so were the other children from the other homes on the street with whom I played, because I never saw better behaved children in my lifetime. They understood, for some reason, the seriousness of the situation. And we stayed there. We made tea. We built a fire. Our parents made tea and coffee, whatever the case may be, whatever they could take with them from their own pantries. And we roasted potatoes. That's the first thing. And every time I hear chestnuts roasting on an open fire, I think of the explosion in the day we roasted potatoes, because we didn't have much of anything else to eat. Bread, everybody, and good homemade bread too. Everybody made their own bread in those days. And they didn't have a bread machine either. They just did it the hard way. And Mother always had homemade bread, so we had lots of food that we gathered up as quickly as possible and took out. And we were out there for, I suppose, about 4 hours or more. Time passes very swiftly when you're faced with great danger. And so I may not be accurate on that. However, we stayed out there until the all clear was sounded, and that was around the noon hour, and it must have been well into the afternoon. I would say 4 hours perhaps was not quite accurate. And then we were allowed to go back. Well, okay, go back to what? There was only one room in our house that was habitable. Our house had moved 2.5 inches on its foundation and settled back again. We had, in the attic, I don't know what you call them today, but they were rafters in those days. And we had 13 rafters split in two in our attic. Our piano in the living room was, you'd think it had been studded with sequins. The glass from the bay windows in the front living room, they had a double living room, just came in and studded itself in the piano. And the chandelier in the middle of the room flew out, wrenched itself out of this, in the seconds, mind you, only seconds, and wrapped itself like a pig's tail around the chandelier in the back living room. Now, I'm sure at this point you're wondering what kind of a story or a yarn I'm spinning. This is factual. It is the truth. I saw it with my own eyes, and I'm sure that an 8-year-old child would remember that the rest of their lives, as I do. And I won't tell you how old I am now, because that's not fair.
Did you know anyone who was seriously injured or killed in
yes.
the explosion?
Yes, yes. Countless friends of ours were very seriously injured. And everybody was pressed into service to doing what they could do. So across the street from us, one girl who was much older than I, they had 5 children, I think. And their father was a pilot boat. Fortunately, he was out piloting a ship way out and was not experiencing that, except the backflow and the backlodge from the tides, which of course disrupted an awful lot of floats. But I mean, she got a job working every day from a certain time in the morning till the afternoon at supper time. She was in her late teens at that time. And of course we were very anxious working at Camp Hill Hospital. We were very anxious as children to know what she was doing. And she said, do you want the job? She said, I'm spending the whole day carrying buckets of eyes. And she had no choice. They had to have everybody who could work. And that was her job, carrying them from the operating room, where people had glass in their eyes and they had to remove one eye, sometimes 2 eyes. And a friend of ours everybody was dazed. Anybody who was anywhere the slightest bit near the site of the explosion, they didn't know what it was, so they didn't move. And one woman who was a friend of my mother's, she was walking around holding her baby in her arms, but the baby had no head. Now, I'm telling you these stories because you will get some of this in Hugh McLennan's book, Barometer Rising, but you won't get detail. And what I'm giving you perhaps may not be very digestible, but it is detail. There were broken arms, there were people who were lifted from Fort Needham, I should say, and carried miles and miles away, and woke up eventually without a stitch of clothing on. That is true. In the meantime, my father, who was assistant city engineer, and spent 20 hours of the 24 at City Hall, and was in charge of putting up emergency housing on the Halifax Common, which, of course, had to be done quickly. Most of it, I think a lot of it, as I remember, my father did take me up to see, because relatives of ours were in emergency housing. And Father thought it was good for my soul to go and see how fortunate I was that I was alive and hadn't a serious accident happen to me. I think, looking back on it now, that he was quite right, because I have carried that with me to be thankful for small mercies. And that was not a small mercy. But we did see it, and I think a lot of the shack, can you imagine, any of you who are listening or might be listening, can you imagine how quickly you could fill up the entire Halifax Common, the entire common, with shacks to house perhaps a family of 6 or more, or 2 or 3 or so on, so forth. Largely they were tar paper shacks but they had to have sufficient sleeping space and sufficient ability to get a meal. Now that had to be done with the greatest expediency. You had to do it because people were sitting out on whatever they could sit on, which wasn't very much. And they had to be done because by supper time of that day, it began to snow a little bit. Gently and very gently at first. But as the night wore on, it became a blizzard and was not fit for anybody. I think that was one of the things my father told us, why they couldn't save some people who might have been otherwise saved, because they couldn't. The storm got so violent so quickly. And then, of course, we always heard all through the night, we heard the foghorn on McNabb's Island, out in the middle of that. And that was the most eerie sound. You haven't any idea, really. It's like something you see in a horror movie today. That's why I don't like them. There's no problem there. But it was, and moreover, there was no way of getting any word to the outside world. There was nothing, no communication whatsoever, because they hadn't had time. Lives were at stake, and they had to do what they could do as quickly as possible.